welcome to the 10 podcast. I'm Lucy, your host, and today we're joined by Ian Watt from Burn 24/7 Europe to talk about prayer and intercession for the nations and what that looks like.
Hi, thanks so much, and thanks for the groovy music as well. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, Ian, just tell us a bit about yourself and Burn 24/7 Europe. I'd love to know more.
Cool. Thanks. I'm living in Bristol and been here on this round for about 8 years, and involved with various different things locally, but also with Burn 24/7 Europe, which is basically a worship movement where we encourage people to build local, we call them furnaces, local kind of groups of worshippers in different places. We do some of that online, and then some people do that also in person, spread across different parts of Europe from east to west, north to south. So yeah, alongside a few other things that I do, that's one of the things that I'm quite involved with over the last, particularly over the last few years. Yeah.
That's awesome, Ian. Is there anything that you feel like God's been speaking to you at the moment?
Yeah, I guess. Recently we've been trying to go through the Bible slowly. I've really had lots of failed attempts at going through the Bible, so I just took the pressure off and said, okay, we'll just sort of get there when we can. And then I have break, go into something else for a while and come back. But so I've been looking quite a lot at 1 Samuel recently. Just finished the end of that, and the story of David and Saul and Jonathan. And I feel quite challenged by it, really, especially David's attitude and how he deals with authority. And it's just this whole thing that you don't need to try too hard. It's always very tempting to try very hard to make stuff happen and change the world and everything else like that. But actually, you don't get that impression with David. I think things flow with him, but he also seems to have an incredible amount of patience. Because the stories are spread over a long period of time. So it is quite incredible that he perseveres. And so even when the circumstances seem very, very difficult, persevering seems to be a big thing for him. So yeah, so I feel I've got a lot to learn from him. It's the better bit of David. There's some failures later on, but I haven't got to those yet so much.
Yeah. I think that's really cool, and just in terms of like perseverance. Yeah, I suppose the thing that I heard you kind of say was like taking the pressure off as well, and that kind of like giving it to the Lord kind of way, or
definitely helps us. Sometimes we put a lot of pressure on ourselves, don't we? And I think we create an environment that then we set ourselves up to fail a little bit, because we've had great spiritual ambitions and goals, but those things should also kind of flow more naturally. So it's been an interesting journey looking at that, and in a way it helps you kind of just review a little bit about your own journey as well. And I think I'm still learning on that one, definitely. So yeah, but definitely is a good book to look through, and especially going into more depth as well, and trying to analyze the characters and how they operate and that stuff. So I found that really interesting, because a lot of things seem familiar, when you read through certain books of the Bible, and then you spend time over something, and it kind of gives you other things that you never saw before. So there's been quite a lot of that happening recently.
Yeah, I love that. It's kind of when you have like passages where you've become like really familiar with, and just kind of like whether it's like random bits, but also kind of seeing them in a new light, or there's something in particular that sticks out, like you've read it like so many times but you haven't seen it before, just something in particular circumstance or something that you've walked through maybe that you haven't before, and that kind of brings different elements to life, which is really cool. Yeah. I suppose, like, also on the topic, I suppose it reminds me of like Samuel, like hearing the Lord and hearing his voice and thinking it's Eli, and I think that kind of kind of segues into like one of our like first question that we're going to talk about what is intercession, hearing the voice of God, and intercession and prayer kind of go hand in hand. For like people listening, I suppose just going to talk about like first of all, like what is intercession and what does it mean to intercede for things, and I suppose what's the difference between that and prayer and praying.
That's a very deep question and a good one. Yes, it's, and it's an interesting one really too. I think sometimes there's lots of a lot of sort of personal angst or kind of Christian angst around intercession. For example, there's a set group of people who are like really good at it, and most people are not. Or it's like most things. You meet a specialist at something, and then you feel quite intimidated by their prowess at how they manage to do something, and I think it's one of those areas that has a bit been characterized like that so often. And I think also that there's a depth of which prayer brings us closer to God, and we sometimes have to kind of revisit that. So intercession is, in some way, someone explained it as standing in someone's shoes, being able to kind of put yourself in their position. And quite frequently, I think what I'm often asking God to do is to give me his heart for a certain people or somewhere or something, an issue, because without that, you don't really pick up on what is God sensing about this. I mean, how does he feel? What's going on? And I think that's really the key to being able to intercede about anything. Really, is you're trying to sort of empathize with what does God feel about this situation, and how do other people feel in the middle of what's going on for them, because then you might also come along passion to pray about that issue because you're interceding for them. And so it is I think there is a sense in which it's very God-given, and then there's also another sense in which it's also persevering and plodding forward, because we really at times don't feel it, and there's a lot of times I think I would say that I'm praying or interceding or praying on behalf of someone or something. I wouldn't say that I'm feeling like deeply tearful, deeply emotional, or deeply kind of connected necessarily. There are times when I am, but there are many times when I'm not. So I suppose it is sharing that journey. But I think the same would be true of any sort of caring face-to-face relationship where you care a lot, but you kind of sometimes text somebody and you're not necessarily in a very heightened state of emotion, but you're making that connection anyway. And I think the same would be true of intercession, that it's definitely deciding and having that impetus to keep connecting with God's heart over something or someone or a place or a group of people or whatever it might be, something that matters. That's I don't know if that explains it very much, but it's sort of there's a similarity to generic sense of prayer. Prayer is engaging with God, but I think intercession is kind of perhaps particularly engaging with God on behalf of, and so therefore you're trying to put yourself in that place of on behalf of somebody to represent them to God. So there's a kind of priestly side of that in that sense.
I love that. I love specifically when you talking about kind of perseverance, kind of linked with what the word that you were speaking initially as well. But I suppose kind of like praying or interceding, like not based on feelings all the time, but like sometimes this is kind of like, yes, like I know, like out of conviction, like I know I need to pray about these like people and places, and like I've committed to this, and I'm gonna like go. So like I feel like I love, because sometimes we can be like led by like our feelings as opposed to kind of like I suppose whether like times where we feel it, and there's some times when we don't feel it. Like our feelings are like come and go, but like I suppose like the convictions or kind of, the way that God uses is the same. So kind of, yeah, I think that's just like super encouraging because I suppose, yeah, it's because like sometimes I think even just like sharing those things are like just super like helpful and freeing that like sometimes your feelings not always going to be like, super. There's a real beauty, and I think there's also a real fruit when you like persevere. And I think sometimes that there are times when you like even when you don't feel it like initially or whatever, then like things kind of like build up and bloom that kind of wouldn't if you hadn't kind of just like gone for it in the midst of um yeah. So I think that's super powerful. What does that kind of look like in terms of when we're thinking about what does it mean to pray for the nations and what it means to pray for different countries? I know, Ian, like you've done quite well. For those people who didn't know, we did a prayer gathering together in January last year, just praying for different countries in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, and you're a part of that, and you helped to lead that, which is also what do you, or maybe what your experiences have been, and like learning and growing what praying for the nations.
Yeah, over sort of quite a few years at different times, I felt quite a passion to pray about various different places, and I guess I was thinking about this before we did this podcast, and I was thinking about probably the first time I kind of remember that more specifically was being involved in some missionaries who were in the east of Asia, and so a friend of mine I connected with. I think it was initially through a dream actually I'd had, and I was trying to make sense of this dream, and then one thing or another that led me to connect up with this particular missionary, and then out of that I went to some meetings and got a bit more informed about what was going on, and started to engage with praying a little bit about what they were doing. And I think that was really the beginning of feeling like I was connecting in a terms of like, especially in terms of a kind of a mission focus. And so over the years, for me, it's been particularly praying for other nations and so on. I mean, some people spend a lot of time praying for the government. Some people spend a lot of time praying for their neighborhood or something. I mean, I pray for my neighborhood quite a bit as well. But I think the connection that seemed to be forming with that was particularly around friends who are missionaries and who had connection with different countries. And then over the years, that's been some of those personal connections had led me to kind of gather a bit more information or awareness about somewhere, and then pray and connect more to pray for certain places. And so it's always been really fun actually to do that with other people. It's sometimes hard to find those kind of people, but it's really good when you do, because it makes it a lot easier. And so I've done over the last few years. I've tended to be quite much more deliberate. I suppose it was a bit on and off at times in the past, but there was always this kind of desire that I would try and. I felt like I needed to pray for places and people, particularly those who are not reached and things like that. So there was a bit of sort of a gap in my life if it wasn't really happening. I found after a while, and then over the last few years, I've had maybe more freedom in my time to pray specifically. And I did used to kind of keep notebooks and different things like that on and off at different times in my life. But I found particularly probably in the last 10 years, I've tended to keep a kind of prayer journal much more. So I've kind of been praying for Europe quite a bit. And I kind of write down places I've prayed for, things I've prayed for. And then I go back over those a little bit as well from time to time, which is kind of really interesting because I've often found what's been encouraging is you sometimes you pray about something and then just quite randomly later on you go back to that notebook and have a look, and then you think, oh, I prayed about that, and I've seen something really happen. And I suppose one area that really felt like there's a bit of a history and a story around it is for example, praying for Albania. I think on and off in
Yeah.
the past, way back, um, there were many Christians at that time who would pray for Albania, really when it was a very closed country, where there was very, very little contact at all. People didn't really know how to connect with people there. It was an atheist state. And
Mm.
then later on, as things changed, we ended up having an Albanian refugee who lived with us for a couple of years.
Yeah.
And really interesting. That was an interesting journey in itself. And then reconnecting with Albanian or Kosovan people more recently as
Mm.
well. And obviously, I met an Albanian missionary back in the spring, and it's just really
Right.
amazing hearing, that change. And I think that's kind of in a much wider sense. That's a real sense of prayer getting answered over a long period of time. But
Mm.
it's exciting, kind of engaging with those journeys. And I suppose for me, more recently, one of the places I've been connecting to quite a lot is Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Yeah.
So I've been praying with some guys there on Zoom, some missionary friends there. I normally pray once a week with them, and that's given me a kind of real connection with that country. And
Mm.
I got to go there in April, which was really amazing and lovely to visit there in person. But
Mm.
so it can kind of come in various different forms. But I think
I can, yeah.
it's great to definitely to make those connections as well with other people. It does help quite a bit. But sometimes it's just that it's almost like that niggling feeling that I just need time to pray. And I find that
Mm.
if I squeeze out that time too much, I don't really have that capacity at all. It feels like something's missing a little bit for me. I feel like I always feel kind of in my happy place a bit when I've got some of that space at least to pray for other nations.
Yeah. Wow. There's a lot of things in there. I think what you're saying kind of made me think as well in terms of like of meeting up with different like folks and stuff, and like the people that you meet, and then from getting to know them, maybe they're from a different nation. It gives you a heart for that nation, or maybe they just have a bit of things on the radar. So I have one of my like best or close friends who I met when I was at university going. We bumped into each other because we were going to a prayer meeting. But she had a background with IHOP in the States, so that's International House of Prayer and stuff. And I think through having a friendship with her, and I suppose that IHOP has like a culture of like praying for the nations, praying for different issues and stuff like that. I think that kind of brought that a bit in my life. I suppose as well as a student, the church that I went to did have quite a heart for praying for the nations and prayer. But yeah, I think like in terms of like the people that you meet, but also the experiences, because I think, like you were saying, I think definitely when you go to a place and experience it, I think it really does like shift your perspective. But yeah, and I think the only other thing was that I interned for a church, and it was like during the COVID. So, we did like a student gathering, and like before that, I did like little prophetic and words of like encouragement for the students. And but some of the students I hadn't met yet, because there's different things you might on like Zoom and that kind of stuff. But I kind of realized that having like prayed for them beforehand, and then having like written little notes and stuff like that. When like I saw them and stuff, I was a bit like, whoa, like I have so much love for you, and this is the first time that I've met you. I just kind of feel like both were kind of praying for the nations or um, people or whatever beforehand. I feel like it means like when you get there, I just feel like the Lord just like opens up like a well of love that you haven't even thought was possible before. Like, oh wait, I actually like feel like the Lord's heart so much for this like place, and I think that's what kind of prayer does. I think it really softens your heart to things, or like opens up your heart to like the way that the Lord kind of like feels or sees a place. And maybe it would be like a thing that you didn't really think of before, or kind of like hadn't been on your like radar or that kind of stuff. But kind of like the Lord was, I don't know, what you've experienced, but that's definitely what I have.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. And I think as well, it sort of, it sometimes feels really amazing when you've been praying about an opportunity to connect somewhere, and then it's opened up and stuff, and God answers that in different ways. And there was a sort of a quite period when I was really wanting to go to to travel over to Europe a bit more, and
Mm.
I it was kind of strange because I felt really burdened to pray about Europe in different ways, from particularly a particular sort of season started about 2014, around about then, and I was staying temporarily at a friend's house. I had a bit more time, and I started kind of praying about different cities and towns and places in Europe.
Mm.
And when that happened, I sort of began to pray about a lot of different places. But I didn't really, and I connected with some friends who were much more involved with Europe and with Burn Europe, but I
Yeah.
didn't really have kind of the means to go there, or particularly the time. And then I was thinking, well, it's kind of like nice to be supported, but I don't really know how I could be that involved. Um, and and then really it was because of Zoom and because of connecting online that really helped an
Yeah.
awful lot with that. And then also God answered prayers in really strange and unusual ways. I
Ooh.
I was I had a kind of local community worker who was working for the council, and they were
Mm.
connecting up communities that were in South Bristol with some community workers who were in The Hague in the Netherlands.
Oh yeah.
And so, as a result of this, because I was involved with that group, then as a result, basically, I was able to go to The Hague, and it was the local government there that paid
Oh.
for us to go. And it was kind of like,
Oh.
I think it was one of those things where you're praying, and that God would do things that just long in your heart to see happen, and He
Mm.
answers them in really unusual ways. I never expected that a local government somewhere else in another country would pay for my flight and accommodation to be there. It was kind of really crazy. So um, it's been encouraging, really seeing some
Mm.
of the things I prayed about. Like going to connect with Bosnia and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Several years later, I've managed to go there at least once anyway. Um, and I think there's a lot of different things which kind of happen in terms of how God just kind of gives us that passion, that burden. One of the strange things
Mm.
I'll say this,
Yeah.
but I mean, don't tell anybody else, but because I don't want intercessors to sound like really weird and slightly eccentric. But anyway, but basically, I quite like because maybe it's an age thing. I don't know. I quite like maps. Like real paper maps.
Yeah.
Before Google, you had real paper, and so I quite like those. So sometimes I have them with me because I find it as like a prompt, and I
Mm.
open up a map and I'm praying about a few places, and I'm jotting it down. I'm going to pray about God
Yeah.
to move in different places. And I remember being on a train once going to Hampton Court where I used to work
Oh,
down
that's
there,
cool.
and yeah, and a nice and of course lots of tourists go down that way. And
Yeah.
I happened to be on the train, and I had all these maps in front of me, and this tourist came over and sort of asked for directions, and I'm thinking like, you've asked the wrong person. I might send you off to Mongolia in a moment. I've got all these kind of like weird and wonderful maps in front of me. So so
That's
so
funny.
just a kind of like a quick warning, like intercession
Mm.
can lead to some bizarre and unusual behaviours, but I don't want to put people off, but but yeah, I just had to confess, there's a certain level of eccentricity, but amongst some people who intercede, but you can be a normal person and very cool and still do intercession. It's all right.
Yeah. Yeah. I do. I think something that reminds me a little bit because I suppose we both have had connection with YRAM or Youth of a Mission, and I think that was for me probably a very fundamental part in like growing and I suppose receiving quite a bit of teaching on what does it mean to pray for the nations. But I think that when you're talking like maps and stuff, definitely done with I suppose just having like just a time just being led by the Holy Spirit in prayer and like having a map and just seeing where you maybe feel like led to pray for a particular nation, that's that kind of stuff, all different things that come to mind and stuff. So yeah. Also, I think what you were saying reminded me of like maybe sometimes maybe I feel like maybe some like different aspects sometimes it comes to the forefront and then sometimes it goes behind a little bit. But I think it kind of reminds me of kind of like Old Testament prophecy and stuff was also like really like visual and stuff as well. Doing kind of like I don't know, I'm trying to think of one on the spot, but it might be kind of like I don't know, like breaking a jar and like this kind of like what I mean. I don't know. It's kind of something that has like a a physical symbolism as well, and sometimes I suppose kind of where it's I suppose with intercession and stuff, sometimes the kind of like physicality of something as well in the kind of prophetic, I suppose, is quite I don't know, just that's what came to mind. It was maybe like a physical act or people kind of as a prayer or as a symbol, all that kind of stuff. I don't know. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that's what it reminded me of your maps.
And I think there are. I mean, we're all different personalities, aren't we? And so I think how we engage is different. It's a bit like when I used a lot of my younger life, I used to quite enjoy bird watching. So, and they used to say there was two types of bird watchers. There was walkers and sitters. So people who like sit and watch, and people who walk about a lot and watch. And I think it might be a bit like that. That there are those. I think because people maybe can feel that like prayer is for elderly ladies who can't go anywhere and sit in their armchair. So I think there's sometimes that kind of like thought that that's the only thing they're left able to do. And the thing is that actually there's something, we all know that revivals like the Hebrides, were significantly impacted by the fact that people who prayed, something happened, So, but I think the more active kind of people love to march around and prayer walk and stuff like that. And I know a friend of mine who used to be in the Middle East, and he gave me a really good DVD quite a long time ago, and it was really well done actually, and it was kind of like prayer walk DVD. So you could kind of play it through kind of thing, and it was the city where he lived, and the guy who was leading his team, and he did a kind of walkabout about the whole city, and then stopped at certain places, and then with certain scriptures, and so it was a really helpful thing. And obviously for them, while they were living there, that's something that they found really useful and helpful. So I know that can be really the physicality of being in a place is really amazing, and I think also the kind of relational side of connecting with people face to face who have a deep connection with that place is really useful too. It's something that I think it comes alive, to people so much more. God can really put a lot on our hearts in amazing ways, quite remotely, but it's really helpful too to have a kind of personal connection with places and find ways even to get better informed about places. I've been praying for Europe quite a lot over the last few years. I started thinking I need to really understand European history a bit better. And as you do that, it makes a lot more sense because you kind of understand the nations you're praying for a bit better, and you try and think, wow, there's such a complex history. I mean, obviously, so many of the countries that TEN works in, there's been the Ottoman Empire, and there's been the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and there's been communism and different things like that. So all these different places are impacted very heavily by their own history, and obviously Bosnia and Herzegovina is a classic example. In the 90s, the Balkan Wars still have an enormous impact on it as a country, and people's kind of emotional, mental well-being and everything. So I think that can really help. I think being informed is really useful, and so you can be a bit of an armchair traveller as well. As well as a real traveller, whichever one works best,
It could be a place, or it could be like a city or whatever. I think as you grow in the Lord, I think sometimes you feel like a bit more of a sense or a spiritual sense, like if it feels a bit like heavy or whatever. And sometimes then you like read up the history and you're like, oh, that makes sense, like why this feels that way around here, because I don't know, there's been like conflict, or there's been, I don't know, could be anything. But I think that sometimes is why it's helpful. You're like, oh, like this is why it feels like this, or maybe this is why I feel the sense to pray, but I didn't kind of know kind of like why. It's just kind of like maybe there's been this stuff going on, or it might be just like being in your community and stuff, and there's been things happening around in your community recently and that kind of stuff, and you just had that sense, and you find out a bit what's going on, and you're like, oh, okay, that kind of makes sense of why I feel like the sense to pray over the city. Or you might, I don't know if about you maybe realize that later. You're like, oh, like I felt like the sense to pray about this thing, and then you realize later, oh, that makes sense why I was praying that, although it seemed random at the time. I suppose history and things that have gone in the past do, unless I suppose it has kind of been dealt with in different ways, or people put off there has been healing, can still leave such a mark, or ingrain in the culture, perhaps without realizing.
Yeah. And my friends who have a kind of a prayer house and a burn worship thing in Bosnia, they actually took on a house which was right on the front line. So in the war, it was where people were firing from, firing at the other side, and so they the original kind of garage which they were using was actually had been a kind of gun turret, effectively. And when they said when people go past there, past that house, also they kind of they're aware that people have a lot of memories around it, and there's a lot of things that may have happened there. They don't know everything that went on, but it felt really significant that they were able to take on that house, and now it's really much their centre of a sort of place of prayer and worship. And they had one. I think one story was that they had one lady who came and I think for Sunday lunch, and was invited just like after church, and she said that it was quite profoundly healing because she had been held hostage there in that building during the war, and they had no idea about that before they invited her to lunch. So it was quite an eye opener, really. And so I think there's a sense where God can redeem places in incredible ways, really, and really change the atmosphere. And I mean, when I went to Bosnia in April, I was very conscious. I had never been there before. Obviously, I was aware of some of the history stuff as well, but it was during Ramadan, so it's kind of quite a different sort of sense of the atmosphere. There's a lot of the part of Bosnia I went to was, is predominantly predominantly Muslim, not entirely so, but predominantly, and it's quite a sort of intense atmosphere in some ways, but it's also really good to be able to be, with other people and pray and worship. And when we went up to another place called Travnik, which is a bit further up into the country, a friend of mine runs a kind of a prayer house there, and that was just great to do prayer and worship there. It was a kind of quite a key center during the Ottoman Empire, so it feels strategic. There's a big madrasa, a big Islamic training school there. Lots of history with the Ottoman Empire, but really fantastic to have people who are kind of creating that atmosphere of prayer and worship in the midst of what can be quite a different sort of atmosphere around them. So so that's a great thing, really. I think that's part of what God calls us to do with prayer and worship is to put a stake in the ground and create an atmosphere around us, wherever God puts us.
Yeah, I suppose it's kind of made me think as well as on that kind of point. I don't know, share more of your thoughts on that in terms of like I suppose it's kind of like how sometimes prayer and worship kind of like break open the way to like things further. And I suppose that's what just came to my mind. And then I suppose it is kind of like a bit of like a Jericho thing in terms of, and also kind of the sense of, all right, thinking it's kind of like the Levites are the ones who are like the worshippers and stuff going out in front, and kind of what, yeah, I suppose what that kind of means of like sometimes the prayer and the worship proceeding kind of like the other kind of ministry related things. I don't know what came to my mind.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's very true. So we often find, that we might be struggling with prayer. I often find those times when it feels quite uphill and it can feel very dry. And but most of the best times of intercession I've had, I would say, probably are really come out of a time of worship, and the two flowing together is a really good combination. It feels quite natural, actually, and worship kind of gets our focus right, and Thanksgiving, really kind of like gets our head straight in a sense, and then prayer comes much easier with alongside that as well. So we can get stuck in one or the other quite easily, but the two flowing together really is a really, really good combination, and it opens the way, like you said, to seeing the way paved for God to work, and that's a really lovely kind of precursor to evangelism, or ministry in different ways as well.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Yeah, it definitely does. Like you said, opens the way to just evangelism, and then kind of like the what's next. And I think it just also because it also flows from a place that well of kind of like intimacy and kind of like and knowing the Lord as well, which is really, really sweet. But it's been really cool hearing. I was just trying to, there's a little niggle or something from what you were saying. I might have to ask you to repeat, because I was like, there was something else that was on my brain as well to share. I think you're basically just repeat again a little bit what you were saying.
Yeah, and I guess it's the whole thing where worship and prayer, leading towards ministry, evangelism, action, all the rest of it. It's very easy to get quite stuck in either worship or prayer.
That's it, yeah.
Because there's a tendency within our culture, sometimes worship is everything or prayer is everything, and they kind of get into separate boxes almost, because we kind of, maybe that's how we do things quite often. We segment things quite a bit.
Yeah.
Perhaps in a like on a Sunday service or whatever. But I think the two things flowing together are amazing, really, and it can also help. And I mean, I confess as well, my sort of personal kind of devotional time, I can kind of like perhaps have a real humongous amount of things that I want to suddenly have a big blast of praying through all sorts of things, or I often find I get to the end of the week, actually, and I kind of really need just to worship much more. My brain is probably quite tired as well, I suspect. But I found some of the best times of prayer, for sure, have been where worship and prayer have mixed together.
That's good.
And when that happens within a community of people too, you can kind of like the prayer room kind of vibe of worship and prayer flowing together. It creates an atmosphere where God does stuff too. I think people are touched by God. He speaks to them. The evangelists are all fired up and ready to go out the door. And all this sort of stuff. People are in. Something happens in that atmosphere, and I suppose that's kind of also what intercession looks like, in the sense we are creating a space where God is revealing himself, and therefore alongside worship, where he's really enthroned, then we create that space, and then in that sense we can also sort of sense God's heart more clearly, actually, which is also another big help to intercession. and we can also sort of springboard into what is God saying, what is God calling us to do next, and that sort of thing. So it's a kind
Yeah.
of like catch-all argument to say that intercession is the best thing since sliced bread,
Yeah.
and everybody should do it, with a good dollop of worship thrown in, you know.
Yeah.
That's my personal, I mean, everybody's got their soapbox, and that's probably mine. I would say, but
No, I think that's good. I think it was leads by me that like sometimes like from when you're in like worship and or like when you're in worship or in prayer, like maybe you're like interceding without really knowing. You just perhaps like people sometimes you don't have the language for it. So I've definitely been in the place that I know that you kind of like maybe you're in like worship and then you start like praying about something and then you just feel it get bigger and bigger and then you feel it's hard to like describe it without like using hand gestures or the physicality of it for me, but you just feel the sense of yeah, it just feels bigger and stronger and maybe yeah, I suppose even outside of your like personality, what you feel is your personality, I suppose like sometimes you just feel like a strong sense of like declaration or whatever it is, it just feels like this because I feel like it's probably time, especially as when growing in the Lord, that I probably was going into prophesying or declaring or kind of intercession. Yeah. But now I probably have a bit more of the language for it. But yeah, just I suppose like you're saying, it also looks different. Like sometimes you're like you're saying you have like during the week it's like something like, oh, I feel like I need more worship now, and like to focus my gaze a bit more on you, or kind of like or sometimes it's kind of like, yeah, I just feel like I need to like be quiet and like have some music and just kind of like soak things in. And then sometimes it's like, nope, now I need to like woo, like form pray. I just feel like it's just, yeah, it looks different. And I think even what you're talking about, like prayer walks and stuff, I think probably when you're talking about like, probably for me as well, like, sometimes like we limit ourselves and what prayer and like intercession can look like maybe. Um, and like sometimes like if you love walking or you love running, like or it might not be that you like either of those things. It might be it might be something else. Like go into like a little gallery and finding like a little spot or a nice beautiful place, wherever it might be. I think it can be done in like different ways. It doesn't just have to be like in a room sat down, but although it can be, and sometimes that's what you feel like is right, it can be quite like physical or walking and praying on the streets or it's really yeah, it's just kind of like that freedom of like the way that the Lord's wired us as well. Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. So do you have I suppose well maybe for like I suppose it's more of a like kind of like finishing question, I suppose. Do you have any encouragements maybe that you want to share with people who may be listening who are maybe new to intercession or have particular places on the heart, or just any last thoughts or experiences that you want to share?
Cool. Yeah, I'd probably encourage people to see if they can connect up with one other person to pray with. That can really help, for sure.
Mm.
And also, yeah, see if one way you can do it is just connect up with somebody that you've got a real passion, and you think, oh, I'd really like to pray about Bulgaria or wherever it is, and sort of connect up somewhere with with someone in that place if you can, and there's a plug for 10 because they know people in all these places, so connect up with 10 and their partners, just to underline that. I wasn't prompted to say that either, so but it can really help, and I
Yeah.
think that God will definitely put things on your heart, as you take some time in prayer. It really happens. So, and I think with most things, no one's an expert really.
Yeah.
We're all kind of learning, and we also go through phases a little bit as well. So I'm very conscious that there are times when people feel, um, all these things feel kind of overwhelming because I feel like, well, I don't really have much capacity. I don't, how am I going to fit this in, or how am I going to kind of, or maybe I started, one day and then I just found like it was a bit impossible. I wasn't managing to achieve this great goal I'd set myself about praying about, X, Y, and Z. And I think it's helpful just to put capacity in step by step, but I would encourage people actually to have, if they want to take time to pray and intercede about things, then have a notebook. And if you're kind of a very creative person, have a plain notebook and draw in it, do everything you need to do, but have a way to record what you're praying when you can. That is really helpful because I think also it kind of gives you a chance to go back and have a look at different times, and it's very encouraging when you do see things really answered, or when you see that God's kind of done something in relation to that prayer. It really does encourage you quite a lot. I used to sort of be involved with a group of people who were we lived for a while in an international hostel, so a lot of students from all over the world, and a friend of mine had a kind of Christian group there, and he's a kind of scientist, so he's very methodical, and I'm not saying that everybody's like this. I'm not like this, so but some people are. So, and he used to kind of like print these little prayer cards, we'd have like a little prayer group, and I mean he's still a really good friend of mine today, and he get everybody to write on one side, so they're like printed out, and write on one side what your prayer request was, and then like tick the number of times you prayed it, and then on the other side there was like a space for how did God answer that prayer, and he did it. I mean, this is like amazing. He did all these statistics about all these prayer cards, of which there were a lot. I mean, he had loads and loads and loads, and so he got all these other people involved with this kind of experiment. I guess we were all guinea pigs to this scientific experiment, but it was really interesting. And it was interesting also because it kind of was helping people really recognize how God was answering their prayers about certain things as well. But statistics, he worked out all these statistics about it. It was amazing. But I think that kind of indicates really that actually, but just kind of like, if there's some way to record, even for your own benefit, it really helps, because I think it gives you a kind of like something to engage with. And I've found that also really helpful to go back to stuff too. So I try and be, I mean, sometimes I'm not very creative at times, but other times I'm a bit more creative. I try and be a bit creative in how I put things down on paper. So however you do that, but I would really encourage people to do it in some form, and have a way that you can go back to things that you've prayed for, what God's been saying, and even if they're themes or specific things that you prayed, because you can pray anything, within the will of God. So you can pray some pretty crazy things, and it's okay. And then you'd be interested to see how God answers those later on.
Yeah, I mean, even what you just said about like very crazy things reminds me of like the verse of like praying like boldly, and like I think it's just a fresh encouragement. Actually, I think it's even for me to be encouraged, like a fresh to write things down, and then also like I think it's good in terms of like buddying up with folks. I think very apt in the city that we live in. With if people haven't heard of George Mueller before, we should check him out. I think, well, I could be wrong, but this is what I know in Lucy's brain is like, I think because he would also be very meticulous at writing down his prayer request. And I think he had documented 33,000 answers to prayer or something like that. It's like something crazy.
Yeah, it is something like that. It is really crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, so for sure, encouragement to like, yeah, because I think when you look back, isn't it? Because like sometimes it could be like on to the next thing, and you're like, because I think so much of the Psalms is kind of like, I'm going through this, but then I remember that you did this, this, and this, kind of like in the past. So I think actually writing it down is also a way that maybe if you're like, go through similar circumstance, being like, oh, wait a second, like you did, like you delivered me from this and this time, so like, why should I be worried?
Yeah,
Kind of thing. So I think that's really encouraging. Oh,
yeah,
well, thank you, Ian. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'll just pray to finish and to close.
yeah.
Um, yeah, Father, just thank you for this time. Thank you for yeah, just we just commit all the things that we've spoken to you, and yeah, Father, I just thank you that you're speaking to the person like listening, and we just pray that yeah, whatever you want to stir up in the hearts, if there's a particular place or people or nation, yeah, that you just bring that to their mind in a way that's clear to them. And Father, we just thank you. Thank you for Ian. Thank you for your love and your heart for him. Thank you for Burn 24/7 Europe. And yeah, we just thank you for who you are in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Amen.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Ian, for joining us. And for those who want to find out about Burn 24/7 Europe, you can find it on the web.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yep.
And we can give you a link as well. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I'll put the link into the description for you guys to see. So yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and bless you. Have an amazing day.
Oh, God bless. All right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the 10 podcast. We are so glad that you're here and that you made it. If you want to find out more about Transform Europe Network, check out our website at www.10-uk.org. Stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe for more episodes.